Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasakawa, and this is episode 124. Today's guest is Farrah Karapetian. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, I'm talking with photographic artist Farrah Karapetian. Farrah Karapetian is an artist based in California. She believes in the agency of subjects, viewers, and authors in the relational structure of artwork, so her methods incorporate sculptural and performative means of achieving imagery that refigures the medium of photography around bodily experience. Her work is in public collections that include the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, and the Museum of Modern Art San Francisco. Karapetian has been named a COLA 2021 Individual Artist Fellow. She was on residence spring-summer 2018 in St. Petersburg, Russia as a Fulbright U.S. scholar, investigating the contemporary resonance of Russian revolutionary theatrical director Vsevolod Meyerhold. She received a grant from the Pollock Krasner Foundation for 2017. She visited Russia in 2016 with a grant from CEC ArtsLink. In 2014, she was recognized with a California Community Foundation Mid-Career Artist Fellowship. She received a grant for artistic innovation from the Center for Cultural Innovation in 2012 and was a resident at the MacDowell Colony in 2010. She currently leads the photography area in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History at the University of San Diego. I was lucky to see Farrah's lecture at the Medium Festival of Photography last month, and it was such an exciting thing to get to see work like this. We got to see examples of her unique photograms and her process creating them, which often involves creating sculptural pieces that she calls constructed negatives. Essentially, with a photogram, one exposes directly onto light-sensitive paper by placing objects between the paper and a light source, and the shadow cast onto the paper by that object creates the image you see in the end. Here, that object is like a sculpture in its construction, but it's used to be the negative to create the photogram. And the relationship between the negative and the image, how each one is constructed, it's doing something that I've never seen before. I've included a link to Farrah's website in the show notes, farrahkarapetian.com. And if you haven't seen her work before, I would invite you to pause the episode and go have a look beforehand. And particularly to not just look at the images, but to read the artist statements as well. The series that we talked about most in our conversation were Muscle Memory, Stagecraft, and Slips and Pushes, so that might be a place to start. I've also included a link to a piece by curator Chantel Paul in Herein Journal about Farrah's work. If you've been listening for a while, you may remember Chantel Paul from my conversation with her in episode 26, and her feature on Farrah's work is a great introduction. Before we get started, a few upcoming events to note. On April 8th, Farrah has a 45-second video piece showing online as part of Anomalous Co.'s Beckett Lab. Tickets for that are $5, and it will be showing at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Pacific. From April 8th to April 12th, you can see Farrah's work in the Diane Rosenstein Gallery's online viewing room at Expo Chicago. On April 10th, Farrah will be in conversation with Tracy Sharpley Whiting, which you can see online via Zoom. They will be discussing the Nardal sisters and French-speaking Black females in the interwar period, whose intellectual, creative, and political leadership has long been overshadowed by masculine genealogies. And then from April 28th to May 12th, Farrah's work will be included in the Venice Family Clinic's 2021 Art Walk and Auction. You can find links to all of those in the show notes, so do check those out. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Farrah Karapetian. I wanted to say before we, really jump in that I really, really enjoyed your lecture at the Medium Festival this year.
Thank you.
It was exactly the kind of lecture that I really enjoy, where it's very clear that you have spent a lot of time thinking about your work and your process, what's important to you, and how your work exists in the world. I think not everybody who makes art considers it so deeply. And so I was very excited to get the chance to talk to you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with what is probably kind of a prosaic question, but I'm hoping that it will kind of lead to something a little bit more interesting. Where I wanted to start was, what is it about the medium of photography that draws you to it? So like a lot of the work that you do and the things that you talked about in your lecture, for example, you mentioned things like capturing a gesture, recording a gesture with your work, and talked about the ways that you, in your process creating the work, are almost recording a performance. And it strikes me that is true in ways that aren't always considered in photography, but it's also true with pretty much all other visual arts that I can think of as well. So what is it about photography that draws you as opposed to some other medium?
I think in high school and growing up, I was always interested in drawing. I was always interested in writing. My family would go see films and kind of had an upbringing that was kind of organically analytical. So I hadn't known that I would look to photography for my kind of base medium. It wasn't until sophomore year of college when my dad gave me a camera and I tried it out that I realized that it would kind of sustain a series of questions. And I probably at the time had no idea how long it would sustain those questions. But what it did was take away a lot of the kinds of constructs that my, again, naturally analytical mind set up for me and put the kind of proof of concept on the wall. So that's obviously become a more elaborate process over the years, but in truth, the work still has to speak for itself. So with drawing, as with writing, regardless of kind of surrealist techniques of automatism, there's a lot of thinking in the way, a picture or an essay is constructed. And with photography, while there's also a lot of kind of collaboration with what's on the other side of the lens when you're using a camera. And that led, of course, to kind of arguments such as Roland Barthes, where, you think you're going for a studium, you're going for, the kind of obvious construct of the photograph, and then you're kind of delivered this kind of punctum, this chance event that actually makes the picture. So it goes for what happens when you're kind of collaborating with the world and the camera. It also goes for these kinds of more, what other people would call constructed practices that happen, as mine do, performatively in the studio, because I can't control everything and I don't want to. I want to set up the parameters for an event beyond my control. And so that's something that, obviously every medium has that potential, but photography is like a net that captures that collaborative act as it happens in a way that, theater is slightly more ephemeral and painting is slightly more premeditated insofar as everything that ends up on the canvas you have put there.
What strikes me about this is that it's your work, like the way that you talked about your work in your lecture, makes it very clear that while there is an element of exploration that's very important to the process of creating this work, and that experimentation also plays a role in, one question leading to another, but that also the process of creating your work, whether it be something like constructing these constructed negatives that you create, and some of which are like the size of a whole room, or whether it's something like the slips and pushes images where you are manipulating ice across photosensitive paper, that there is this very methodical approach. And I guess I'm not sure if that's exactly the right word, methodical, but because it comes across that way to me anyway. And yet what you're describing is sort of the happy accident, and it seems to me that those two qualities are sort of necessarily in tension with each other. Is that something that you feel as you're making your work, that tension, and is it important to your process, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. I mean, even using the slips and pushes, as you mentioned, as a really kind of baseline example, those are very simple pieces. It's a rectangle of photo paper that is machine cut, it's 8 by 10, 11 by 14, 20 by 30, I believe. And the variable in them is, of course, the ice. So it can seem very simple as far as like some kind of an abstract argument about movement, color, light, transparency, and it is. But it does come out of this kind of larger process and construct. I was making them initially towards an installation at the Orange County Museum of Art. I was asked to participate in the California Pacific Triennial, and I wanted to look at the space of the institution as such. What is this place of history making, and what belongs here? What kinds of artifacts are we used to participating in, or do we not even notice that we participate in? And so I kind of wanted to implicate a viewing audience in that process of history making. And so I constructed this kind of wall, this ruined wall around an aperture in the gallery, so that they would kind of have to walk through it. So in order to do that, I was trying to make rocks. I was trying to build a wall of photographic rock. And photographs are usually made in an instant, and in this case, this would be a large kind of construct that was made out of numerable instants, but also not photographs of rocks, they're photograms of ice being something that has material that's somewhat similar to rocks visually. If you're casting light through it, it has kind of inclusions and other kinds of organic material, but it's not a rock. And so I began this process of, freezing ice in rectangular bags of particular dimensions, taking them to the darkroom and putting them down on the photo paper, setting the aperture and the color. And yet with all those kinds of intentions and parameters, ice will behave as ice will behave. And it began to kind of slip around on the paper. So although I did end up making enough rocks to build an installation, I also had to notice that something was happening under my hands. And so that first phase of work I call slips, because they literally were slipping around on the paper. The second phase of that work is called pushes, because I kind of became aware of the process and began to move them intentionally around the picture plane to kind of be aware of that space in the same way, on some level, that I was aware of the museum as a space. I think it's important for an artist to interrogate, material as well as context. And if context is a museum, it's an institution, obviously the interrogation is of a different nature than it is if the context is the picture plane. Some artists really do pick one kind of space to interrogate, but for me, they go side by side.
So I'm interested in a thing that you said a minute ago, where you said you wanted to implicate the viewing audience in the process of history making. Mm-hmm. And this idea of in your lecture, you talked about centering the audience. This seems related to me. For example, when you talked about the muscle memory work that you did, that it was important to you that image, the photogram of the veterans stacking a door, that it be to scale, so that as the audience is coming into this space, that this is what they're presented with. I'm interested in this idea of having the audience be an integral part of it. And I feel like this relates to what you were saying about performance as well. I don't remember if you said that in this conversation, but in your lecture, you talked about performance as being part of it, whether that be perhaps the performance of the process of making the work, or a more explicit kind of performance, like in some of the video work that you have done. But the idea of including the audience in that it's interesting to me, especially because, and this relates both to the audience portion of it and just the process, again, of making the work, that, as you said before, theater is more ephemeral, whereas visual arts, and especially photography, are, at least to my mind, they're very much about the static image. That's sort of part of the thing, that it doesn't change over time so much. And I'm interested in how these interact with each other, if that makes sense. I think I was a little babbling there, but
no. Yeah, I mean, this question of the centered audience brings up another reason why photography is such an interesting medium for me. Unlike
most other mediums, it really does have this kind of historical kind of cathextion to the idea of truth and fact. I mean, we hear that potentially there were audiences for the first frescoes who really believed in their veracity, but we, at least as 21st century citizens and 20th century citizens, have a lived experience of a few generations of people who, no matter how much we know at the forefront of our minds that photography is manipulable, whether digitally or through analog means, or even just through the position of a viewer, of the author, of the photographer herself. No matter how much we know that, we trust it. It's still accepted in courts as evidence. It's proof that your girlfriend cheated on you. It's everything, we have a lot of trust in it. And yet we behave with photographs as if they are kind of windows onto these other realities. And so every aspect of our lives is potentially performative. Even if you think about literature like Irving Goffman's book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, there's the potential to look at every social interaction as performative. But how do you make someone aware of that performance, of the fact that they are in fact participating in a theater? How do you kind of inculcate a sense of presence in someone who's viewing, a sense of awareness that they are doing so? For me, that I try different kind of tactics in that regard with each project, not necessarily thinking, aha, how am I going to implicate the viewer? But but each project does kind of call for a different kind of participation. And sometimes it's okay for a picture to remain a picture. And I have to trust that a viewer will, having followed the thread of my other thoughts, work with that picture and think their way through it. But sometimes, as in the case of the OCMA installation or the muscle memory piece, I do kind of very deliberately shape it around an architecture. And in fact, that was the impetus for the muscle memory piece entirely. The veteran who kind of came to me at the time, Justin Wilson, had heard that I worked in response to spaces and that I worked in response to muscle memory. And he brought to me this idea that, in fact, soldiers work this way. And obviously dancers do too, and athletes do too. They have to feel their way back into postures through their bodies. And especially in special forces, they also respond to sight. So they can feel their way towards their targets, as it were, given touch. And so how to unite the haptic with the optic in photography should be more difficult. But in fact, photographs, imagery, shadows, reflections exist in physical space already. It's not like a hybrid. It's not like a Rauschenberg. It's, it really is, if you look around your room right now, a fact that photographic space exists in three-dimensional space. I have a light that I'm staring at right now that's casting a shadow of my bookshelf in three different directions onto my wall and my floor. And so, knowing that light works that way, why should it be confined only to a pseudo two-dimensional space on a wall? And that's kind of, a lot of different ways into that kind of work. But it all is essentially photographic. So again, it's not really just the fact of my kind of origin story with the medium that it had the potential to surprise, but also that it has the potential to play with fact and fiction and our awareness of that. And then that it's really everywhere, and that there may be a way of opening it up into space that kind of instigates and catalyzes different kinds of memories in viewers and participants.
I think there's been a lot of ink spilled on the idea of the photograph and the subject being ontologically different from each other. And yet the fact that the lay audience tends not to be conscious of that, even though we know it, it's still not something that we think about a lot. And I've always found this a really interesting idea, I think also, one thing about photography is that it can't help but be referential in this way, because whether you're working with a camera or not, even whether you're working in making images that are more sort of abstract looking, right? Like I'm thinking of an artist like Claire Warden or my friend Paula Riff, who made photograms that were really not necessarily obviously referential, but the recording of the information on the paper, it's still a reference to the fact that there was something in between the paper and the light source, right? And you can't really get away from that. And it seems to me that this is sort of the inherent thing that makes photography different from other visual arts, even though they can all usually, I guess they must all be referential in some way, but that the specific way that photography is referential is sort of unique to the medium. And it does seem like this plays into your work, but I guess I want to sort of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of whether or not you want to be literal with that, right? So, I mean, the idea of the rock photogram that I used for the OCMA installation, my joke there, my little photo joke there is that, yeah, sure, there's a reference. It's a piece of ice. It's not a rock, but it's making you think it's a rock. That's a very literal kind of example of what I'm trying to say, which is to say that what if the photograph is, as I think Leah Ullman wrote about my first solo show after grad school, what if the photograph is less a record and more a metaphor? So if there's something going on in front of it, why does that have to be the thing? Why can't it be a reference to what it is you want to say, as language enables? I can be very literal and only speak in Hemingway's terse, kinds of grammar. And I understand the difference that a word is a symbol and a photograph seems not to be in relation to its referent. But I think there are different ways of handling that. And for me, the metaphor is kind of instinct, even in terms of the materials I use. If I'm going to use glass negatives, it's functional and it provides a reference of say the drum set or whatever, the symbols, but it is not a symbol. It's not a functional symbol. First of all, it's divorced immediately from function, and it has inside of it so many other layers of photo jokes and material resonances, and so that's one of the ways I think it's possible to look at an expanded vocabulary of photography is that it doesn't have to be one-to-one in terms of the relation of the referent to the representation.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And this sort of gets at another question that I had related to the way that you install the work, which is that with several of these installations, you are installing the constructed negatives with the images, right? Like, so with the stagecraft images, you've created what's sort of like a scale model of a drum set, right? Or with the muscle memory, you've created these resin replicas of war weapons. With the I don't remember the title, but the series where you were looking at buildings, you have these rebar structures that you're installing with the images. I mean, there's one level of question here, which is the work the image, or is it the negative, or is it both? You referenced Thomas Demond in your lecture, who, builds these models and then destroys them, that the final work is the image. I always also think of Vic Muniz doing something similar with his sculptures and that end up not being displayed, right? But you are actually displaying the sculptural element. And when we talk about the metaphor of it, the metaphor is more legible to me in the negative than in the image itself, if that makes sense. But can we dig into this part a little bit?
Yeah, no, I did begin to do that intentionally. I think I began doing it, first of all, with the kitchen and its negative, because that was the first negative ostensibly that I made. And I wanted you to have to turn from one to the other in order to parse for yourself what was going on, and to recognize what was lost in one versus the other. Of course, that one is the most metaphorical of all of them, because there's no photograph, there's only burnt plywood. And, the only way you see inside the space is through a variety of apertures. And obviously burning is also a photographic metaphor. So there are a lot of kind of fun photo jokes in that one, but it's not essentially a photograph. But yeah, I always, I've only shown that once, but it was always installed in my studio kind of around a corner. So you'd have to kind of hold in your memory one of the two as you looked at the other. But then around the same time, when I made that, I also made a shipping container piece where you walked in and you saw negative and photogram at the same time, as well as the thing from which the negative derived, which was the shipping container itself. And I wanted you to kind of compare all of those levels of remove from experience, because I think that's a philosophical question of why we represent, period. That's Plato's cave right there. So, then, aside from a philosophical standpoint, I also want to, enable visual literacy. It tends not to happen, even if I put in my shows where I have shown the drum set, I've always been very careful to light it so that you can kind of see the shadows happening in situ. And then again, you hold that in your mind, you go outside, you look at the photograms, and you realize that some kind of a dance with this light and shadow play has been kind of executed and frozen in these other kinds of representations. And I want to create that kind of literacy because I think that viewers, especially of photographs, are unused to tracing process. So for me, it's a fun game as far as philosophically, enabling the steps of representation, but it's also to some extent helpful. I remember in undergrad, I would go to the painters' studios from in the grad school at Yale, and they all talked about process, and they would leave these little marks all over their studios, little envelopes with paper, with paint swabs and stuff on them. And it was a big part of the way the work was discussed. And of course, process is discussed in photography as well, but there are fewer traces that I think people understand how to follow. And so it has just become another one of my breadcrumbs that I leave in the gallery. And that has also become more complicated. So in my more recent shows, I don't do quite so much of a one-to-one relation between the object and its image. I think the last time I did that in an exhibition may have been Stagecraft. The Building, Dwelling, the Thinking show, indeed, I did put the rebar blocks in the room. But even at that point, they were becoming a little bit, the negatives were becoming a little bit less object-oriented and more manipulable. And so as of the last couple of exhibitions, I've included transparent objects, I've included objects, but they don't necessarily correlate in the same kind of one-to-one relation to the photographic imagery.
I think it's a really interesting question to say, like, how can we make the audience consider the process more? And how can we make the audience perhaps question the relationship between the photograph and the subject? I guess the question that I have is like, well, and you even posed this question just now as well, is why represent in the first place? Right? Because I think to me, one thing that's interesting about this is, when looking at the Stagecraft work, the way that you described it in both the lecture that you gave at Medium and in your artist statement is that this is work that is sort of about your father and your relationship with your father. So there's an emotional component to it that seems to me, at least, to be very sort of separate from the philosophical question of what is a photograph. And it, like, you can kind of get either of those experiences out of it, and you can get both of them at the same time, but that the one doesn't necessarily relate to or at least for me, and I don't know if this is, I'm weird in this way or what, but at least for me, I find the question of what is the relationship between the image and subject? What is the ontology of image as object and object of image? These are super interesting questions. And also the experience of what is my relationship with my father? What is the relationship of my father to me? What does it mean to be in a family and relationship? These are also interesting questions. And they're ones that, by considering those images and installations, I can access both of those, but the one doesn't really lead me to the other. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that they rely on one another at all, for sure. I think, there are different reasons to do different things, right? So you have someone like Vanessa Beecroft, or perhaps more poetically Tino Segal, who puts the body in the room with you. And then you have someone like maybe James Van Der Zee or Reineke Dijkstra, who then photographs the body, and the gaze is straight at the author, at the photographer, and therefore kind of meets the gaze of the subject. And those two things do very different they exact a very different kind of reaction from an audience. But at least with both of them, you have an awareness, because of the gaze. You have an awareness that something is happening that is other than sliding by you, other than lived reality. And so I think, one of the reasons why I came to kind of rely on constructivism, or that kind of moment in theater that led to Brecht and other kinds of practices like Boal's, a very concerted effort to make an audience aware of what's happening around them. No matter how far into everyday life those practices bled, they still had parameters and constructs around them, as I described my process as well, where the representation is there. It's clearly separate. There's a line in the sand between what happens between us performatively or in terms of representations, and what will happen to you when you leave. But perhaps you carry with you the sense of awareness of construction into everyday life, and you participate differently in society, or whatever is the kind of end game of the artist.
I am always really interested in sort of when I think about art, that what does the existence of this work of art, what does it do? Like, what's the function of the art? And like the fact that it exists, that it is, and not just that it exists, but that it is being shown. What does this accomplish in the world? I feel like this is something, I kind of feel like this is a relevant question to anyone's work, but, particularly because some of your work is very explicitly political in nature, whether it may be addressing, questions of migration, or you have the teleprompters and flags images that are, they're very clearly and explicitly about the sort of political moment that we were living through at that time. So it seems to me that these are definitely communicating something. And moreover, that they do have a sort of specific point of view, like political perspective. But then not all of the images, not all of the work that you make is sort of explicitly political in that same way. I'm always curious about, what does the work accomplish? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I remember in high school reading Aristotle and catching that line that, man is a political animal, and kind of realizing and kind of relying on that idea that politics is really just about interaction between one person and another. And so I think all of my work is political in that way. And I think, like the word abstract, we tend to use the word political in a way that kind of abbreviates its potential significance. And I think the teleprompters, I actually haven't ever shown those, but I like them. And the teleprompters are kind of a literal transcription of this kind of wish that these politicians might in fact listen to some of the things that are being said by people and speak to those things instead of to what they imagine they should speak. So that is indeed, a transcription of my moment in America, in the United States of America. But, the work about my father's hospitalization is also political insofar as it's about that relation between myself and hospital staff, or myself and his body. And so, I wouldn't push that point that that all the work is political, but I would like to imagine all of it on a spectrum that doesn't rely, say, on the politics of a very particular moment in order to engage the relations between people who are always thinking about the same things. I mean, migration is a question we've always, as humans, had to contend with. And even the things that get written on signs at protests, tend to repeat these instincts, that have come up earlier in political life around, questions of belonging and otherwise.
Yeah. So I wanted to switch gears to one more thing before we hit the break. To me, all of your images they're visually striking and very beautiful. And I'm always really curious, I think partially because I'm trying to figure this out for my own self, my own work as well. But I'm really interested in what beauty does in an image, in art. The simple question is it important to you that your images be beautiful? I think a slightly more complicated question might be, if your images are beautiful, what does that enable in the experience of your work, and what your intention is for that to enable? And maybe even more interesting to me is, if the images are beautiful, does that obscure something? And if so, what? And is that a problem, or is that the point? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the first question I would ask, I think a typical response to that would be, beauty invites the viewer in, and then they ask hard questions, and and then the kind of response to that as well is that not potentially divorcing the content from its gravity. And there is a whole conversation around that, Ingrid Sishi and David Levi Strauss had, for example, around Sebastião Salgado. There is a history to that conversation, but I think I would pause before even getting there and ask, what kind of beauty, right? If you're thinking about someone like André Breton, he's looking in Nadia for a convulsive beauty, violent, uncontrollable, right? And so there are many kinds of beauty. And I think if the internet has a tendency to abbreviate as well as our kinds of habits do. So, for example, one of the reasons why I haven't shown photograms this year pretty much anywhere is because I really believe in them as physical objects. They're beautiful, yes, in the sense that they are harmonic, and there are interesting questions of palette that you can kind of, relate to one way or another aesthetically. But in person, my feeling is that they're also bodies, and they have scars of their making. They have mirrored, I use a metallic paper, so they tend to have a kind of a relationship to the way you are in front of them. I mean, they're not like actually mirrored surfaces, but they have a relationship to your body and to the room. They oftentimes don't have exactly square edges because I'm cutting in the dark. And then, especially increasingly, as in the last exhibition, the photograph is always now, the kind of deployment of the chemistry is messy and in a way, I'd say convulsive. It's not enabling you to see everything you think you want to see, and thereby, again, kind of divorcing you to some extent from the literal nature of that referent or that content, and asking you to see the way it's written, the way it's made, the way it's conveyed. And so I think that beauty is complicated, right? You might have 10 people in front of you, and they may all officially be palatable humans, but only one of them will kind of attract, if that. And so the question is your goal to make something pretty? I've never had that as a goal. I don't start out a series to make sure that someone's going to find it aesthetically appreciable. I get there usually, but that's only because I have to be, a good sentence, a good sentence is constructed well. It flows, it has punctuation, it has, a subject and a predicate, but also potentially clauses. And a picture should feel like a well-constructed sentence, but not necessarily a happy one.
One of the things that I've been thinking about recently, and it just happened that, I was reading this book. It's called Keats's Odes. It's by Anahid Nersessian, and she makes this interesting argument about Keats's ode on a Grecian urn, that that this poem is, one that's considered one of his great odes. It's something that people have talked for hundreds of years about how beautiful it is. And she makes the argument that this poem, the beauty of the poem is very deceptive and distracting from the actual point of the poem, which is like that the poem itself is a comment on the fact that the poetic beauty and poetic form are a way of entrancing the reader away from the violence that's actually being depicted on this Grecian artifact. And it's a violence that in this particular case is like a sexual violence that is pervasive throughout both Keats's culture and our current culture. I thought it was a really interesting argument to make. And she particularly makes this argument that Keats has left little markers throughout the poem that indicate that he is not drawn into the beauty of it, and that he wants the reader to not be drawn into the beauty of it. This has sort of reminded me of, as I was reading this, it reminded me of things that you were talking about in your lecture regarding your work, that you leave markers to try and get people to figure them out. But also that you mentioned, that a lot of times people don't, right? And I guess it's a sort of this thing that I've been turning over in my head, this same question that she poses about Keats and that you're posing in your work, and that in a way, artistic beauty, whether it be through language or through image, is very sort of intoxicating. It's almost like porn, right? Like it is accessing a part of your brain that is at a deeper and more dominating level than conscious thought and analytical capacity. And so that it has this way of, if you're entranced by the beauty of it, then you may not want to look further than that. And that if the work is saying more than just, I am a pretty thing to look at, and especially if it's saying something important that seems important either to the world or at least to the artist, that there might be some kind of ethical question there. But at the same time, that I think that even if the beauty makes most people miss it, that for the person who does look through it and has the experience of having worked it out, that experience of working it out is something that isn't replicable in any other way. And so that the understanding that that person achieves, you can't get there in a more direct way. I don't know if I'm articulating this right. I know I've talked for a very long time, but does this kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think so. He's using a structure in the same way that potentially I use the photograph as a construct through which you enter. And there's a fluency with a medium that one earns, right? So over time, you learn how to use your tools so well that you can use them wrong. I think at that point, that you're playing a good game when the medium and you are kind of in this dialogue. So when he uses this structure, but he kind of uses it wrong, in the same way that I can think of innumerable poems where when the structure breaks, you notice. And I do that with many of the moves that I make in photography. There's something that kind of breaks your experience, whether it's the more obvious stuff or the less obvious stuff. So there's that as a kind of a construct. Is it ethical to make something pleasurable? I think that the question of the ethical, again, has more for me to do with how the relations are set up and less to do with the questions of the aesthetic pleasure of it. Because I think that many of the artists whose work relies on a kind of an absence thereof may not be understanding that there's an aesthetic to everything. So even if you're working with the aesthetics of the document or the archive, you're working with an aesthetic. So the question is, how much of that aesthetic are you then transforming? And is it transformation that makes something beautiful, and therefore subjective seeming? And is it actually ethical? I would argue, I think so, to make clear, to clarify for a viewer the subjective position that you're taking. So, for example, if I wanted to talk about my dad's hospitalization in a way that that purports to be objective, I might show you his hospital bills all over the wall, just Xeroxes of his stupid hospital bills and say, hey, look, this is awful. Or I might, just take a picture of him, dying. And, those are kind of objective things. When I first asked a basic photo class that included one of the veterans that I ended up working with, I asked them first day of class, is the photograph objective or subjective? Some kind of question along those lines. And everybody was like, subjective. The veteran said, well, when people die and you're out there in war, you get your cell phone camera out or whatever digital camera, and you take a picture of the head this way, the head up, the head the other way. And that's as objective as I can get. And I said, well, but isn't there an aesthetic to that kind of photography? I mean, not to push in an area that might be sensitive, but since you brought it up, doesn't that have a particular look to it? And if you were then to use that on, someone who's living, wouldn't you then be ascribing an associated kind of imagery to something that you'd like us to think about in terms of that inference? So that's my response to that. I mean, I don't think there's any kind of representation, performative or otherwise, that isn't inflected by an aesthetic. Even if you just put your naked body in a room, there's something you've done to your body that is a choice. And so to deny it is for me the unethical part of journalism. It's the unethical part of human behavior. When you deny that you are coming from a position, that's when it's wrong.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your answer. Why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Something that's on my mind has been kind of interwoven with something I'm teaching, something I'm working on, and kind of what's going on around us in the States right now. I've been really immersed in this literature from the interwar period. I think you heard me talk about that a bit at the Medium Festival. And I've also kind of arranged so that I'm teaching about some of this literature so that I kind of get to stay in that headspace and also share it, of course, with students. And one of the pieces we've talked about recently is by Jane Nardal. It's written in like 1928. And Jane Nardal is from Martinique, but she wrote this, I believe, living in Paris, a student at the Sorbonne. And it's called Exotic Puppets. And her sister Paulette, who's older, wrote another kind of a piece. I think it's called In Exile, around the same time. They're both pieces about living in Paris as Caribbean women. Afro-Latin is a term that they had established at the time, but they're really kind of beginning to parse, beginning to kind of create a language that would go on to be far more elaborate in other writers' hands, but really setting a foundational language for questions of exoticization, fetishization, the life of the woman in the city. And a lot of this has been coming up for me this week because of the murders of the Asian American women, and this kind of intersection of exoticization, sex work, female identity, vulnerability in a lot of different intersectional ways. And I've really been wondering if my students, I've asked them, but I've been wondering if they find correlations. We've been working with it otherwise to talk about exoticization and to talk about how interesting it is that there's this precedent from 1928 that is a kind of a bedrock for later writing that really very few people end up relying on because these women's voices are so silenced, I suppose. And I don't know that my students are really beginning to make those connections as passionately as I am. But for me, it's so useful to find these early 20th century and sometimes late 19th century texts by these women of color and other writers of color, instead of simply giving my students and relying on for myself later writing. I'm really finding it useful to look for a trajectory from the last 100 years, really, rather than to imagine that only now people are finding the words to kind of embody this particular experience. I don't know. Is there a particular author that you look to when you think about questions of exoticization? Are you a Said fan or?
I'm not sure there's necessarily a specific author that I look to. I will say, I think in general, a lot of my reading, which is really predominantly contemporary, but it's been a heartening thing for me to look at, publishing remains a very male-dominated and very white-dominated, very straight-dominated space. Mm-hmm. But at that, I think a lot of my writer friends and people that I know in the publishing industry, there's a lot of conversation about it becoming more diverse now than it has been in the past. And even if it's still just sort of a token amount, that it is meaningful, getting to read, say, poets from Asian backgrounds, Asian American backgrounds, or Latin American backgrounds who have been living through the same time period that I've been living through has been something that it's been meaningful to me because in a very similar way to what you're talking about is not just across like racial identity, but also across time. And I think that there's a lot of value to that in the experience of solidarity, and whether that's just an emotional kind of solidarity or a more concrete and material solidarity, I think there's a lot of value in that. What I think about a lot is the way that having this common language, we run a little bit of a danger of erasing differences and distinctions that are meaningful as well. And I feel like this sort of constant push and pull between these two different actions or different desires, because on the one hand, there is the pull towards solidarity, and on the other hand, there is a pull towards what we might call disaggregation. Mm-hmm. And I think these are both really kind of important. I don't know if balance is the right word to use, but like having a way to acknowledge both of those things simultaneously feels important. And I'm not sure that even though the discourse around this has been going on a lot longer than a lot of people realize, I don't know that we have really fully formed a language that encompasses both of those. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why I find it so important right now to look for precedent and to look for history is because it can feel as if this kind of, and especially for my students, I think, who are just encountering these conversations for the first time, it can feel as if there's this huge white patriarchal hegemonic history, and then there's new stuff. And I just want to open up the idea that white patriarchal hegemonic, iceberg may simply have ignored on purpose this other transnational, pan-ethnic conversation, forever. And that indeed there has been a strong intellectual tradition, of course, coming from all sides in not balanced kind of, language of solidarity per se, but that, there has been argument, there has been conversation across continents and ethnicities around these questions, and it's traceable, and it's concurrent with other historical moments, so that, like, if you're looking at questions of, is art supposed to make a point, or is it supposed to be self-expression? Is it supposed to be subjective, or is it supposed to be propaganda? You have a precedent in Alan Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois that conversation started in the Harlem Renaissance. It started with the writing of people of color, and it's, become elaborated over time, even as it's been marginalized and occasionally forgotten, and then resuscitated and forgotten again and resuscitated again. And I think if we are, as we are, always having trouble finding words and language and strategies, maybe part of that is possible to address by looking to the fact that language has already been crafted and can now be refined. Certainly, I don't ascribe to all the kinds of ways that these people were talking about struggle at the time. They had different words than those we'd use now, but they had the same experiences or similar ones. So,
yeah, sort of to the point of what you were saying about, the purpose of art, is it self-expression? Is it to make a point? Is it to try and affect some kind of change in the world? That I think it kind of always does all of those things all at the same time, and to one degree or another, right? I think that when we're talking about, a descriptive language to describe exoticization or, racial struggle or, gender struggle or any of the different kinds of marginalizations that people have experienced over the entire history of our species, right? Like, there is a lot of value in finding that precedent, as you say, so that we can take it and refine it. I think also that, like, when I think of somebody like Du Bois, or even earlier, somebody like Frederick Douglass, who, they have a lot of like a really explicit sort of agenda with the writing that they do, and opinions about what writing ought to do. Some of those opinions have gone on to be very vociferously sort of argued against. Like, I'm thinking about how Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, is, makes a lot of arguments against W.E.B. Du Bois's earlier writings. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, one, that there can be difficulty in making that bridge, because even though there is always the baseline concern of racism or sexism or what have you isn't necessarily different, but the particulars of it are different, and how we imagine is the right way to address these things changes over time as well. And it's hard to get at that with, like, any individual writer's output. But more than that too, like, something I think about for myself specifically as an Asian American is the ways that identity can sort of inhibit this kind of solidarity or understanding of things as being the same, so that a person, I think we're starting to develop a language now that shows the solidarity and the similarity in the interaction in a more comprehensible way. But I think, the history of, for example, the Asian American community and the African American community is one that has been fraught in a lot of ways. Even though they are intertwined, they haven't been understood to be intertwined until fairly recently. And that it's just something that, when I think about you asking your students about whether they see a similarity between these Afro-Latin women writers that you're mentioning and the situation, the shooting in Atlanta, and it may not be immediately legible to them. I guess I'm thinking about the ways that the failure of our language inhibits that identification across a perceived difference. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things with respect to that latter point. I feel like one of the beauties of that moment, that interwar moment, is that people were publishing these journals, right? It's almost like, as prolific as we have blogs now or podcasts. They're publishing these journals in the States, in Paris, all over the place. And they don't all agree with each other. Alan Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois don't agree. And, Jane and Paulette are publishing people in their journal who end up having, taking a far more rebellious stance against fascism, colonialism, and end up eventually starting their own journal, right? But the idea of that conversation is, I think, why I got into creative work, right? That there's a conversation you're getting into that no one's ever right. The language is never perfect, even in one's own work. You write something, you make a picture, and it should pose questions of your own practice and your own relationship to whatever it is you just wrote about, that pushes you to write the next thing or make the next thing. And if you end a work and there are no questions, it's not a good work, So I think that's my entry point into those people's writings. And when I read them again with students, sometimes I feel as if the language is very apparent to me. It's very obvious to me that this is antiquated and maybe it won't be as accessible. But I think about how even then these women from the Caribbean or people from Boston were writing in solidarity with Ethiopians who were having Italian invasions at the time, or Paulette was writing on behalf of Syrians who were having French bombings. After World War I ended, of course, war continued in colonial spaces, and these Black writers were writing about those struggles because they understood in a kind of a Black internationalism. And they also understood that internationalism wasn't exclusive to Blackness. It was a Caribbean identity, and they wanted to know, am I French? Am I Caribbean? Am I Black? And there are women on a neighboring island that curator Stephen Wong has worked on, whose identity was similarly in question in terms of Chineseness and Caribbeanness. So I feel like this kind of wonderful complication when I look to that moment in history that really rhymes with my experience of the present, even though, again, the writing is just groping for a vocabulary around racialization, because there isn't one particularly yet. And I think it's the groping that's exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you can, as the reader or as the audience member, you can sense the creator of the work making an attempt, there's something that feels admirable about that, and perhaps even inspiring. I guess I do sort of, like I always do, kind of come back to, especially with at least certain topics, and race being one of those topics, that it's hard for me to separate the process of the work from the intended function of the work, if that makes sense. And it's not to say that everyone needs to be doing, I believe Du Bois had an idea that Black writers should be presenting Black life as in ways that are always sort of uplifting, to sort of portray Black people in a certain way that, in a way to try to persuade white people to not be racist. These days that would be considered a very old-fashioned and kind of offensive idea. And yet I still can't help but think that there is so often, whether the writing is, perhaps 100 years old or whether it just came out last week, again, we come back to this question of why represent, right? That there's some motivation in the artist in doing the thing. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel separable to me. And so I guess it seems unsatisfying to be left with an unanswered question, even if the questions are not ultimately answerable, that there still feels like some kind of a goal in mind. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The Du Bois, there's this one essay that he writes. I mean, he's not I'm much more kind of fascinated by these women personally.
I know. I was just talking about because I haven't read them, so what I am familiar with.
Right, but he does have one essay that I had my students read that in which he's arguing for propaganda, that all art is propaganda, and obviously in deed as well as in word he argued for uplifting images of Black diaspora, but he also in that essay writes about how white makers might spend some time looking at trauma in their own circles rather than always making work about trauma in Black circles. And he said he thought that every culture should have the opportunity to produce propaganda, positive or negative, about their own community, and that white people should not be deprived of that option. So they shouldn't just all go out and write about, Black trauma. And I think that's a really interesting kind of early kind of snide remark around something that we see now in terms of re-traumatization. Every time someone gets murdered, you see these images kind of circulate online, and there might be a kind of a humanitarian instinct to do that, but it's re-traumatizing, right? So I use that also as precedent of like this question of trauma, as well as like Mark Seeley recently published a book called Decolonizing the Camera, and he has a study of a lantern slide lecture that he argues is the first kind of white humanitarian use of photography to consolidate white power, but also to try to get something good done in the Congo under King Leopold. And he uses this as this precedent for, a white author going out there and photographing othered subjects and kind of accumulating this sense of their own agency as authors around these people's lives, rather than actually opening up the situation to the agency of the subject. So yeah, from Du Bois to this lantern slide lecture and Seeley's writing about it, there's a wonderful kind of trajectory around questions of trauma. And from Jane Nardal through Said, through, more recent writing, even than the Orientalism, I feel like there's another trajectory. And for me, that again is a big part of why I'm in this field, just because apart from even issues of transnationalism, transtemporalism is one of our luxuries as artists and writers, right? I mean, we get to kind of cultivate this network of thinking around our work. Some of it sticks, some of it doesn't, but that's more useful than having a stable full of artists in a gallery that you're showing in, right? It's a kind of a home of sorts.
Yeah. I mean, I always think about the ways that language and art, specifically artistic language, I guess all language is communication, but the way that, reading a book, a novel, a poem, whatever, gives you some kind of access to somebody else's experience or mind state. Mm-hmm. And being able to do that over some distance in time. I mean, I guess you're always doing it over some distance in time, but doing it over a more significant distance in time, there is something kind of magical about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I had any follow up to that, but yeah.
Yeah, who's your art family, Mike? Mine is weird. I have a Russian revolutionary theater director who Stalin killed. I have Caribbean female writer, and potentially a Japanese surrealist from the interwar period as well. I'm really actually honestly reincarnated from the interwar period. There's just no doubt about it. Everyone I identify with is like from that period. Yeah. Just different countries.
I feel like this kind of communication that we can have allows a feeling of community that can be expansive in both space and time. And there's a lot of value in that, like in a lot of different aspects of the experience of life. I mean, things that we think of as being explicitly political, there is this aspect of solidarity, but even on a more personal level, I mean, this is in a lot of ways very explicitly why I do what I do as an artist and a writer, is because, I'm lonely a lot and I want to feel less lonely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And you want to understand. I mean, I think one of the kind of I don't mind that, self-help has become so lovely for so many people, such a resource for so many people. But one of the things I don't understand about it as a genre is why it's more effective in creating a sense of having been seen or what have you than reading a novel. Like I've always read to understand myself and to understand others and to understand dynamics between, again, this kind of question of relations. And I get all of that from a novel, which now it seems as if there's an entire genre that distills those points that you might pick up if you were reading or if you're just simply an observant person in public and puts them down in bullet points. And I wonder, if, what happens when the world becomes a bullet pointed list? Like, is that as effective a tool for creating citizens that really get along?
Yeah. Well, and that, I think kind of gets back to something that we were talking about in the first segment about the experience of art or literature or any kind of creativity. It shapes how you understand the message insofar as there is a message. I remember there's a friend of mine, his name is Daniel Abraham. He's a science fiction and fantasy writer. And I remember, I'm sure I've brought this up on the show before, but this is the first time I'm talking to you about it, that he had this blog post once where he wanted people to discuss in the comments this provocation that he put forth that obscurity in, I think he's specifically talking about in science fiction literature, but just in that obscurity in a work of art is either a failure of execution or a statement of contempt by the artist. I don't know to what degree he was being really serious about that, but my response to that was just that sometimes the experience of obscurity forces the audience to do work that they wouldn't otherwise have to do, and that the experience of having done that work shapes their understanding of the experience itself. And there's value to that. I guess, to think about this in terms of self-help is that the nice thing about the world that we live in is that we do still have access to both, right? But I guess some people are either unable or unwilling to do that amount of work, so that obscure the experience of puzzling through obscurity is going to miss some people. And maybe there's still value in those people getting an approximation, even if it's not as deep or meaningful an experience, even having an approximation for somebody that's going to miss it in some other form. Maybe there is value to that too.
Yeah. And, I actually have friends who are really into it. And so I definitely don't ever intend to judge what works for them. I simply am curious about it because it is such a different way of accessing that, crucial information about social interaction. It's not like I'm better at it than they are. I mean, we're all awful at it really in the end, but I do think that having to look for it, not only in a narrative, but also potentially through language that's specific to an author rather than, for example, to a ghostwriter, is really, for me, it's been a crucial part of kind of honing my capacity to discern what's going on. And now I think that there are potentially more ghostwriters. I mean, I've done it. Have you done it? I've done ghostwriting. I think I'm a bad ghostwriter because I have, my language seeps into it a little too much. You're supposed to kind of just convey content in a fairly neutral way. And you can feel it when you pick up a book that's been written that way. Any politician's book is generally narrated and then, ghostwritten and edited and approved. And you can feel that, absence of subjectivity in the voice. For me, that inhibits my capacity to really know them. But for other people, it might make it more accessible. It's really interesting.
It seems like in the specific case of the political memoir, probably some significant fraction of those memoirs are not really made with the intention of them being known authentically. that could be a little cynical of me, but I don't know if it's too cynical.
I'm sure you're completely right. And I'm sure then we're missing out on like the 21st century Frederick Douglass, right? I mean, someone whose voice is as important as the content of what they say. He proved his point not only in terms of what he said, but how he said it. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah, it is. That might not be the most terrible place to wrap up. There is one question that I always end with, and that is, I mean, we kind of touched on this already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The question is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I am really liking, I'm surrounded by so many things. I mean, COVID has been awful for all of us and worse for those who've experienced real loss. But in this one strange way, it's been productive for me, which is to say that I have bought so many books. I am surrounded by new texts. I don't know why I hadn't been buying books for a while, but I hadn't. And so one that I have in front of me is Robert Rauschenberg's Borealis from 1988 to 92, which is when he was making these gorgeous kind of fraught screen prints on metal, different kinds of metal. And this is a tactic that I've been wanting to try, and I'm about to kind of try it. And so I wanted to buy the book to see if there are any clues from another era beyond time and space, since it's entirely new to me, way of transcribing photographic imagery. I am also surrounded by I have Marie Magdalene Carbet's Martinican stories. She's one of the kind of Martinican writers from between the wars that I don't talk about a lot, because she's not really part of the same circle of writers and thinkers, but she's fabulously interesting. I mean, she and her wife lived in Paris and Martinique for years, collaborating on fiction and theater and music. And there's literally only one picture of this woman's face on the internet. And so I've been indulging in reading all of these texts, and in the act of finding their faces, and in the act of kind of missing their faces, and therefore feeling that I really need to fill that gap. But yeah, that's mostly what I'm surrounded with. I Wonder As I Wander by Langston Hughes, and Lola Alvarez Bravo's weird urban collages, and Setting Sun writing by Japanese photographers, and Ida Carr's photograph. Yeah, just a ton of books around.
Well, listen, I have really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time and talking with me.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to Farrah's website, where you can see examples of both her photographic and her video work. You can also find links in the show notes to several of Farrah's upcoming events, including her upcoming Zoom conversation with Tracy Sharpley Whiting about the Nardal sisters, so do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please share it with someone else who might enjoy it, and if you happen to do that on Twitter or Instagram, tag us at ChannelOpenPod. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. Next time, I'll be talking with writer Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. That will be coming on April 21st, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.